What if the Ottoman Empire didn't die from defeat, but from an experiment meant to make it immortal? In the spring of 1915, a directive emerged from Constantinople that would seal the fate of an empire that had endured for 6 centuries. Classified documents, hidden for decades in Turkish state archives, reveal a systematic operation that began with midnight arrests and ended with the disappearance of an entire civilization from lands they had inhabited for 3,000 years. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to imagine what it means when an empire that has stood for over 600 years collapses not from external conquest, but from a wound it inflicted upon itself. This is a story about choices that echo through generation and about decisions made in smoke-filled rooms that reshaped the map of an entire region. If stories like this fascinate you, if you believe we must understand history's darkest chapters to prevent their repetition, then click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these crucial historical investigations to light. Also, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is right now. I love connecting with our viewers across the globe. Now let's continue with the story. Constantinople stood at the crossroads of continents in the winter of 1914, its minarets piercing a gray sky heavy with snow and uncertainty. The Ottoman Empire, having ruled from the Balkans to the deserts of Arabia for more than 6 centuries, now faced its greatest trial. The Great War had erupted across Europe, and the aging empire had cast its lot with Germany and Austria-Hungary, entering a conflict that would test every institution, every alliance, every assumption upon which Ottoman power rested. Within the empire's vast territories lived dozens of ethnic and religious communities, each with their own languages, customs, and histories. Among the most prominent were the Armenians, an ancient Christian people whose presence in Anatolia predated the Ottoman conquest by millennia. In Constantinople alone, Armenian merchants controlled significant portions of trade. Armenian craftsmen were renowned throughout the empire for their skill. Armenian intellectuals contributed to newspapers, taught in schools, and practiced medicine and law alongside their Turkish and Greek counterparts. The Armenian neighborhoods of Constantinople bustled with activity that winter. Shops displayed fine textiles and jewelry. Coffee houses filled with animated conversations about literature and politics. Churches held services in a language that stretched back to the 4th century. For generations, Armenian families had woven themselves into the fabric of Ottoman society, prospering under a system that, while imperfect, had allowed various communities to coexist with relative autonomy. Yet beneath this apparent stability, dangerous currents were gathering. The empire had suffered humiliating losses in recent decades. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had stripped away European territories. Nationalist movements threatened to tear apart what remained. Ottoman leaders, particularly those in the Committee of Union and Progress, who had seized power in 1908, increasingly viewed diversity not as strength, but as vulnerability. Secret meetings were taking place in government buildings, where officials spoke in hushed tones about threats both real and imagined. Documents later discovered in Ottoman archives reveal a growing obsession with loyalty, with the fear that minority populations might side with enemies in the coming struggle. The Armenian community, with its cross-border connections to communities in Russian-controlled territories, became a particular focus of suspicion. As winter gave way to spring in 1915, families went about their daily routines, unaware that decisions had already been made in rooms they would never enter, by men whose names most would never know. The machinery of destruction was being assembled with bureaucratic precision. awaiting only the final orders to begin its terrible work. The night of April 24, 1915, began like any other in Constantinople. Families gathered for evening meals. Children completed their schoolwork by lamplight. In Armenian households throughout the capital, there was no indication that this ordinary Saturday would mark the beginning of an extraordinary catastrophe. Shortly after midnight, the arrests began. Ottoman police, working from carefully prepared lists, moved through Armenian neighborhoods with systematic efficiency. They knocked on doors with the authority of the state behind them, presenting orders that offered no explanation, no charges, no hope of immediate appeal. The targets were specific: intellectuals, community leaders, anyone whose voice carried weight among the Armenian population. Krikor Zorab, a renowned novelist and member of the Ottoman Parliament, was taken from his home in the early hours. His wife watched helplessly as officers led him away, his protest that parliamentary immunity should protect him falling on deaf ears. Across the city, similar scenes unfolded. Doctors were pulled from their beds. Lawyers were arrested in their nightclothes. Poets, journalists, educators, and merchants found themselves suddenly in custody. Bewildered by accusations, they were never formally given the chance to answer. By dawn, over 200 Armenian men had vanished into military prisons and detention centers. Their families rushed to police stations, to government offices, anywhere that might provide information or hope of release. They were met with bureaucratic stonewalling, with officials who claimed to know nothing or who insisted the arrests were temporary measures for the men's own protection during wartime. Personal diaries preserved from this period capture the growing panic. One woman wrote of her husband, a pharmacist, who had never expressed political opinions, being taken by 3 gendarmes who refused to say where they were bringing him. Another described the eerie quiet that fell over her neighborhood as families realized that speaking too loudly, protesting too visibly, might make them the next targets. The arrested men were held in deplorable conditions. Cells designed for a handful of prisoners held dozens. Food was scarce, sanitation non-existent. Interrogations, when they occurred, focused on extracting confessions of conspiracy, of coordinating with Russian enemies, of plotting rebellion. The lack of evidence for such accusations did nothing to secure releases. Within days, the roundup expanded beyond Constantinople. Similar arrests swept through Smyrna, where Armenian merchants had long dominated trade in figs and tobacco. In Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, teachers and clergy found themselves imprisoned. The pattern was unmistakable. The Ottoman government was systematically removing anyone who might organize resistance or even document what was coming next. Foreign observers in the capital recognized the ominous nature of these events. American missionaries who had worked for decades alongside Armenian communities began sending worried reports to their boards back home. German military advisors attached to Ottoman forces noted the arrests in their correspondence, some expressing confusion about why valuable citizens were being treated as enemies. The Armenian community, suddenly leaderless, struggled to understand what was happening. Churches became gathering points for worried families seeking information and comfort. Whispered conversations speculated about reasons and duration. Some clung to the hope that this was indeed a temporary security measure, that once the empire's leaders were satisfied of Armenian loyalty, the arrested men would return. But in government offices, officials were already preparing the next phase. The April arrests were never intended as an end in themselves. They were the opening move in a much larger operation, one that would require removing anyone who might have the authority, the connections, or the credibility to sound an alarm loud enough for the world to hear. The imprisonment of Constantinople's Armenian leadership ensured that when deportation orders began flowing to the provinces, no coordinated response would be possible. 3 weeks after the Constantinople arrests, the Ottoman government issued a decree that would transform the landscape of Anatolia forever. On May 27, 1915, the Tehcir Law was promulgated, authorizing the deportation and relocation of populations deemed threats to military security. The language was bureaucratic, almost mundane in its phrasing, speaking of temporary resettlement for the duration of hostilities. The reality it unleashed was anything but temporary. The law gave military commanders and provincial governors sweeping authority to order the removal of entire communities. No trial was required, no individual assessment of guilt or innocence. Residence in certain areas was itself deemed sufficient cause for expulsion. While the law's text did not explicitly name Armenians, its implementation left no doubt about its primary targets. Telegraph lines across the empire crackled with encrypted messages. Orders flowed from Constantinople to provincial capitals, from governors to local administrators, from military headquarters to gendarme posts in remote villages. Historians who later gained access to Ottoman archives discovered the paper trail of destruction, preserved in official communications that revealed the systematic nature of what was beginning. In the eastern provinces, where Armenian populations were most concentrated, the orders arrived with chilling precision. Village headmen were summoned to government offices and informed that their communities had 24 to 48 hours to prepare for departure. Families that had farmed the same land for generations, that had built stone houses meant to stand for centuries, were told to take only what they could carry. The scenes that followed were repeated in village after village, town after town. Families frantically sorted through possessions accumulated over lifetimes, trying to decide what could be abandoned and what was essential for survival. Heirlooms were buried in yards with the desperate hope of eventual return. Livestock was sold for fractions of its value to Turkish neighbors, some of whom paid fair prices out of genuine sympathy, others who exploited the desperation of people with no bargaining power. Churches became temporary warehouses as families brought their valuables for safekeeping, trusting that sacred spaces would be respected. Priests recorded the deposited items in ledgers, issuing receipts that would ultimately prove worthless. The faithful prayed for protection, for mercy, for some intervention that would reverse these incomprehensible orders. Government officials assured deportees that this was indeed temporary relocation, that they would be settled in new areas where they could continue their lives until the war's end permitted their return. They were told to expect organized transport, adequate provisions, and protection during the journey. Documents were prepared, travel routes were mapped, and destinations in Syria and Mesopotamia were designated as resettlement zones. But other documents, marked confidential and restricted to higher officials, told a different story. These communications, discovered decades later by researchers sifting through archives, revealed that authorities had no intention of actually resettling the deportees. The designated destinations lacked infrastructure to support the arriving populations. No provisions had been stockpiled along the roads. The gendarmes assigned to escort the convoys received instructions that contradicted the public assurances of safety. As the first convoys assembled in town squares across the eastern provinces, families clung to whatever hope they could manufacture. Some believed they would indeed find new homes, that this upheaval would somehow lead to safety. Others, reading the faces of the gendarmes assigned to guard them, sensed something darker ahead, but felt powerless to resist the armed authority of the state. Foreign missionaries working in the region watched with growing alarm. American and German witnesses documented the scenes, noting the absence of transport vehicles for the elderly and infirm, the inadequate supplies provided for journeys through harsh terrain, the separation of able-bodied men from the convoys even before departure. Their reports, sent through diplomatic channels, began painting a picture that contradicted official Ottoman claims. The deportation machinery, once set in motion, operated with bureaucratic momentum. Daily quotas were established for the number of deportees to be processed. Train cars were requisitioned where rail lines existed. For areas without rail access, the deportees would walk, driven along routes that led through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the empire. Summer descended upon Anatolia with merciless heat as the deportation convoys began their journeys into the Syrian desert. What Ottoman authorities had described as organized relocation quickly revealed itself as something far more sinister. The routes chosen deliberately avoided major roads and towns, instead winding through desolate terrain where help would be impossible to find and witnesses would be few. The convoys stretched for miles, columns of humanity driven forward by gendarmes on horseback. Women carried infants in their arms and supplies on their backs. Children as young as 5 or 6 walked beside their mothers, their small feet already blistering in the heat. The elderly, those who had spent their lives contributing to their communities, now struggled to keep pace, knowing that falling behind meant being left to die alone. Water became the most precious commodity. The routes avoided rivers and wells, and the small amounts of water the deportees had carried from their villages ran out within days. Under the relentless sun, dehydration claimed its first victims. Bodies began appearing along the roadside, families forced to abandon their dead without proper burial, without even the time to say proper prayers. The convoys could not stop for grief. Food supplies, already inadequate at the journey's start, dwindled rapidly. The deportees had been promised provisions would be available at stops along the way, but no such supplies materialized. Some attempted to forage for wild plants, but the arid landscape offered little. Others tried to buy food from Kurdish villagers, whose lands the convoys passed through. But most deportees had nothing left to trade except the clothes on their backs. American missionary reports from this period documented the systematic nature of the suffering. Dr. Clarence Usher, stationed in Van, recorded testimonies from survivors who reached his mission hospital. He described women whose feet were so torn and infected they could no longer walk, children whose ribs showed clearly through their skin, elderly who had simply laid down by the roadside to wait for death. The gendarmes assigned to guard the convoys offered no protection when bands of irregular fighters attacked. These assaults, far from being random acts of violence, followed patterns that suggested coordination. Armed groups would descend on the convoys, selecting young women and girls to abduct, killing men who attempted to defend their families, and stripping the deportees of whatever valuables remained. The gendarmes would watch, sometimes participating in the looting, making no effort to intervene. Some deportees attempted escape, slipping away from the convoys under cover of darkness. A few found refuge with sympathetic Turkish or Kurdish families who risked severe punishment to hide them. But most who fled were quickly recaptured or died alone in the wilderness, unprepared for survival in such harsh terrain, without supplies or knowledge of safe routes. The Euphrates River, which should have offered relief from the terrible thirst, became instead another instrument of death. At river crossings, Gendarmes would sometimes force entire groups into the water, those who could not swim drowning, while those on the banks were prevented from helping. Bodies floated downstream for miles, a gruesome testament witnessed by villagers along the riverbanks, who later provided accounts to investigators. As weeks turned to months, the deportation routes became corridors of death. The ground was littered with abandoned possessions, too heavy to carry any farther. Clothing, books, religious items, family photographs, all the physical remnants of destroyed lives lay scattered in the dust. And among these objects, increasingly, lay the bodies of those who could go no farther. German military officers allied with Ottoman forces witnessed these marches and sent disturbing reports to Berlin. Major Count Wolf Metternich, the German ambassador, wrote of convoys he observed, describing scenes that shocked even men accustomed to the brutality of warfare. His dispatches noted that this was no mere relocation, but rather a death march designed to eliminate the deportees through exposure, starvation, and violence. By autumn of 1915, hundreds of thousands had been driven into the desert. The fortunate, if such a word could be applied to any of the deportees, were those who died quickly. Far worse was the fate of those who survived week after week of walking, watching their families disintegrate around them, losing first the elderly, then the very young, then finally succumbing themselves to exhaustion and despair as short of the destinations they had been promised, but would never reach. While Ottoman authorities maintained their public narrative of wartime security measures, foreign observers stationed throughout the empire were documenting a reality that contradicted every official claim. These witnesses, protected by diplomatic immunity or the neutrality of humanitarian missions, began compiling evidence that would eventually pierce through the fog of wartime propaganda and official denials. Henry Morgenthau, the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, occupied a unique position of access and credibility. From his embassy in Constantinople, he maintained relationships with high-ranking Ottoman officials, while simultaneously receiving reports from American consuls and missionaries scattered across Anatolia. What these sources told him grew increasingly alarming with each passing week of 1915. Morgenthau's initial communications to Washington reflected diplomatic caution, but as evidence accumulated, his language became more urgent. In July, he cabled the State Department describing not relocations, but rather a campaign of race extermination. His meetings with Ottoman Interior Minister Talat Pasha revealed a chilling bureaucratic detachment. When Morgenthau inquired about the fate of deported Armenians, Talat responded with cold pragmatism, suggesting that the empire was solving its Armenian question permanently. American consuls in provincial cities sent detailed reports that painted a comprehensive picture of the unfolding catastrophe. Leslie Davis, consul in Harput, documented mass killings near Lake Hazar. He personally witnessed bodies washing up on the lakeshore and investigated sites where thousands had been executed. His dispatches included specific dates, locations, and methods, creating a record that would prove impossible to dismiss as wartime rumor or exaggeration. German military advisors, despite their nation's alliance with the Ottoman Empire, could not ignore what they observed. General Otto Lyman von Sanders, commanding German forces in the region, witnessed deportation convoys and reported his concerns to Berlin. Other German officers stationed in various provinces sent similar accounts. These reports created tensions within the German government, torn between maintaining their crucial alliance and acknowledging the atrocities being committed by their partner. Armin Wegener, a German medic attached to Ottoman forces, went beyond official reporting. He secretly photographed deportation scenes, capturing images that would become some of the only visual documentation of events Ottoman authorities desperately wanted hidden. His photographs showed emaciated deportees, piles of bodies, and the aftermath of massacres. Wegener smuggled these images out through diplomatic pouches, risking severe punishment for his defiance of orders prohibiting such documentation. Missionary organizations, particularly American Protestant groups that had operated schools and hospitals in Anatolia for decades, found themselves reluctant witnesses to destruction. Their institutions had served Armenian communities for generations, creating bonds of trust and friendship that made the current crisis deeply personal. Missionaries like Maria Jacobson in Harput kept detailed diaries recording daily observations of deportations, violence, and suffering. These witnesses faced an agonizing dilemma. Reporting what they saw risked their expulsion from the empire, ending their ability to provide any assistance to those still alive. Remaining silent, however, meant allowing the world to remain ignorant of ongoing crimes. Most chose to document and report, accepting the personal risks involved. Dr. Martin Niepage, a German teacher at a technical school in Aleppo, witnessed the arrival of deportee survivors in that city. He described scenes of unimaginable suffering, with people arriving in conditions suggesting they had endured weeks of brutality and deprivation. His written account, published in Germany in 1916, provided detailed testimony of Ottoman atrocities from a German national, lending particular credibility given the alliance between the two empires. Johannes Lepsius, a German Protestant minister with long experience in the region, conducted his own investigation in 1915. Despite Ottoman efforts to restrict his movements, he gathered testimonies from survivors and witnesses, compiling evidence that he would later present to the German government. His documentation included accounts from Turkish officials who expressed horror at orders they were being forced to implement. The cumulative weight of these testimonies created an undeniable record. These were not enemy propagandists or biased observers, but rather diplomats, military officers, doctors, teachers, and missionaries from neutral or allied nations. Their reports came from different regions, different time periods, and different perspectives, yet all described the same fundamental reality: the systematic destruction of the Armenian population. Newspapers in America and Europe began publishing these accounts. The New York Times ran dozens of articles throughout 1915 and 1916, detailing the deportations and massacres. British and French publications, though focused primarily on the Western Front, devoted space to reports from their own diplomats and missionaries. The international community was learning the truth, even as Ottoman authorities continued their denials, and the machinery of destruction continued its work. By autumn of 1915, the fragmented reports from individual witnesses began coalescing into a comprehensive picture of systematic annihilation. What had initially appeared to be isolated incidents or regional excesses revealed itself as a coordinated operation spanning multiple provinces, implemented with bureaucratic precision and horrifying consistency across vast distances. Survivors who reached Aleppo, one of the designated endpoints for deportation routes, brought accounts that defied comprehension. They spoke of mass drownings in the Euphrates River, where hundreds of deportees at a time were forced into gorges and swept away by the current. Turkish gendarmes had stood on the banks, preventing anyone from attempting rescue, turning a natural waterway into an instrument of mass death. Witnesses described the systematic burning of villages after deportations. Once Armenian populations were removed, homes that had stood for generations were set ablaze, ensuring no possibility of return. Churches were desecrated or converted, their records destroyed, erasing physical evidence of centuries of Armenian presence. Orchards were uprooted, businesses were seized, and property was redistributed to Turkish settlers, completing the erasure of entire communities. The scope extended beyond the eastern provinces. In regions across Anatolia, wherever Armenian communities existed, similar patterns emerged. The city of Diyarbakir saw its Armenian quarter emptied through forced marches. Trebizond on the Black Sea coast witnessed deportees loaded onto boats and drowned at sea, their bodies washing ashore for days afterward. Each location had its own horrific details, yet all followed the same fundamental template. Dr. Floyd Smith, an American missionary doctor, documented conditions at a makeshift camp outside Aleppo, where deportee survivors gathered. He described seeing people who had been reduced to walking skeletons, their eyes hollow with trauma, many too weak to speak. Children orphaned by the marches wandered among the dying, having lost all family members. Disease ravaged the camp, with typhus and dysentery spreading rapidly through the malnourished population. Photographs smuggled out of the empire provided visual confirmation of witness testimonies. Images showed lines of deportees stretching across barren landscapes, emaciated children with distended bellies, and the aftermath of massacres that left landscapes littered with remains. These photographs, though limited in number due to Ottoman restrictions, offered undeniable evidence that this was no ordinary wartime relocation. Reports indicated that entire towns had been effectively erased. Zaytun, a mountain stronghold where Armenians had maintained fierce independence for centuries, was emptied completely. Its population, known for their skill as craftsmen and their defiant spirit, was marched into the desert and never seen again. Similar fates befell dozens of other communities, each with its own history, culture, and contributions to the region. The methods varied by location, but shared a common brutality. In some areas, deportees were herded into caves that were then sealed or set ablaze. In others, groups were taken to remote gorges and shot, their bodies left for scavengers. Young women and girls were systematically separated from convoys, sold into slavery, or forced into Turkish and Kurdish households. These victims, though they survived physically, lost everything that had defined their identities. German consul Walter Rüssler in Aleppo maintained meticulous records of the deportee arrivals in his jurisdiction. His cables to Berlin in late 1915 estimated that hundreds of thousands had already perished. He noted that among the survivors reaching Aleppo, the mortality rate continued to climb due to disease and starvation, suggesting that the final death toll would far exceed initial estimates. Turkish officials who objected to the implementation of deportation orders faced dismissal or worse. The governor of Ankara, who attempted to mitigate the suffering of deportees passing through his province, was removed from his position. Others who showed mercy or tried to prevent killings were reassigned to remote posts. The message was clear. Implementation of the deportation policy was not optional, and humanitarian concerns would not be tolerated. By the winter of 1915, informed observers understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in scale and organization. This was not the chaos of wartime violence or the spontaneous outbreak of ethnic hatred. The paper trail of telegrams, the coordination across vast distances, the systematic nature of the destruction all pointed to centralized planning and deliberate execution. The deportations had effectively destroyed the Armenian presence in Anatolia. Communities that had existed for 3 millennia had been scattered, killed, or forced into desperate hiding. Churches stood empty or burned. Schools that had educated generations were closed. Businesses that had driven regional economies were shuttered. An entire civilization's physical presence had been methodically erased from the landscape, leaving behind only memories and the testimonies of those who had witnessed its destruction. As international awareness of the atrocities grew, Ottoman authorities found themselves forced to address mounting questions from both allied and neutral nations. Their response combined categorical denial with elaborate justification, constructing a narrative that portrayed the deportations as unfortunate but necessary wartime security measures, rather than the systematic destruction that witnesses described. The Ottoman government's official position rested on claims of Armenian treachery and collaboration with Russian enemies. Interior Minister Talayat Pasha issued statements asserting that Armenian populations in eastern provinces had engaged in armed rebellion, sabotaged military operations, and welcomed invading Russian forces as liberators. The deportations, according to this narrative, were defensive actions taken by a government fighting for survival against both external invasion and internal subversion. Government-controlled newspapers in Constantinople published articles detailing alleged Armenian atrocities against Turkish civilians. These accounts described massacres of Muslim villages, cooperation with Russian military forces, and preparations for armed uprising timed to coincide with enemy advances. Ottoman officials pointed to isolated incidents of Armenian resistance as evidence justifying the wholesale deportation of entire populations. Yet documents later discovered in Ottoman archives revealed the profound disconnect between public justifications and internal communications. Telegrams between provincial governors and Constantinople showed that deportation orders preceded any significant Armenian resistance in most regions. The timeline established through these official records demonstrated that alleged rebellions were often consequences rather than causes of deportation policies, as desperate communities responded to the destruction being visited upon them. Some Ottoman officials privately expressed discomfort with the policies they were ordered to implement. The governor of Konya, Reshid Pasha, attempted to protect Armenian deportees passing through his province by providing food and shelter, allowing rest periods, and preventing attacks by irregular forces. His humanitarian actions earned him removal from office and reassignment. His replacement implemented deportation orders with the ruthlessness Constantinople expected. Similarly, Hassan Mazar Bey, governor of Ankara, sent reports to the central government documenting the suffering of deportees and questioning the necessity of such harsh measures. His cables described the deportations not as military necessity, but as actions causing immense human suffering without clear strategic benefit. He too was dismissed, replaced by an administrator more willing to follow orders without question. These instances of resistance from within the Ottoman administrative structure suggested that even some Turkish officials recognized the deportations as unjustifiable. Their removal and replacement with more compliant administrators revealed the determination of the Committee of Union and Progress leadership to see the policy implemented, regardless of objections or humanitarian concerns. German officials, caught between alliance obligations and moral discomfort, sought clarification from Ottoman leadership. Ambassador Paul Wolf von Metternich met repeatedly with Ottoman ministers, pressing for explanations that could reconcile witness accounts with official claims. In these private meetings, Ottoman officials were more candid. Talayat Pasha reportedly told German diplomats that the empire was taking advantage of wartime conditions to resolve its Armenian question permanently, a frank admission that contradicted all public statements. The Ottoman government also attempted to restrict information flow, limiting the movements of foreign observers and censoring telegraph communications. Missionaries found their correspondence increasingly monitored and sometimes confiscated. Diplomats faced restrictions on travel outside Constantinople. These efforts to control information suggested an awareness that an unrestricted observation would undermine the official narrative. In some instances, Ottoman authorities staged managed tours for foreign visitors, showing them carefully selected deportee camps where conditions had been temporarily improved. These propaganda exercises aimed to demonstrate humane treatment and organized resettlement. But the choreographed nature of such visits was transparent to experienced observers, who noted the absence of typical deportation conditions they had witnessed elsewhere. International legal frameworks of the time offered limited recourse. The concept of crimes against humanity existed only in embryonic form, and Ottoman sovereignty provided legal cover for actions taken within its own borders against its own subjects. The empire could claim that internal security measures, however harsh, remained domestic matters beyond the jurisdiction of other nations. As 1916 progressed, the Ottoman justifications became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence. The sheer number of witnesses from multiple nationalities, the consistency of their accounts, and the emergence of photographic evidence made dismissal of atrocity reports impossible for informed observers. Yet the Ottoman government continued its denials, knowing that wartime exigencies prevented Allied intervention and that German alliance considerations discouraged strong German objections. The disconnect between Ottoman claims and documented reality created a historical record that would prove impossible to erase. Every justification, every denial, every attempt to portray systematic destruction as legitimate security measures was preserved in diplomatic archives, missionary records, and survivor testimonies. The empire was building not just the physical machinery of genocide, but also the documentary evidence that would ensure future generations would know exactly what had been done and under what false pretenses it had been justified. As evidence of mass atrocities mounted throughout 1915 and 1916, the international community faced the question of how to respond to crimes being committed by a sovereign nation against its own population. The answers that emerged revealed both the moral consciousness awakening in the face of unprecedented horror and the practical limitations imposed by global war and political calculation. On May 24, 1915, even before the full scope of the deportations became apparent, Britain, France, and Russia issued a joint declaration. The statement represented a significant moment in international law and diplomacy, explicitly condemning the Ottoman government for crimes against humanity and civilization. The phrase itself was relatively new, attempting to articulate a category of wrongdoing that transcended traditional concepts of war crimes or treaty violations. The declaration warned Ottoman officials that they would be held personally responsible for their actions. It represented an attempt to establish individual accountability for state-sanctioned atrocities, a concept that would later become fundamental to international criminal law. However, the immediate practical impact was limited. The Allied powers, locked in total war with the Central Powers, lacked the military capacity to intervene directly in Anatolia to stop the ongoing destruction. Religious leaders worldwide added their voices to the condemnation. Pope Benedict XV personally appealed to Sultan Mehmed V, urging mercy and an end to the persecution of Christian subjects. The appeal went unheeded, as the Sultan held little real power under the Committee of Union and Progress regime. Protestant and Orthodox church leaders issued similar statements, creating a unified religious response that transcended denominational differences. In the United States, still neutral in the broader war, public pressure mounted for action. Newspaper coverage of the atrocities generated widespread outrage. Former President Theodore Roosevelt called the events the greatest crime of the war, demanding that the Wilson administration take a stronger stance. However, President Woodrow Wilson, focused on maintaining American neutrality, limited official responses to diplomatic protests. American relief organizations mobilized to provide humanitarian assistance. The Near East Relief Organization, founded specifically to aid Armenian survivors, launched fundraising campaigns across the United States. By 1916, millions of dollars had been raised, a remarkable sum that reflected genuine public concern. Relief workers attempted to reach survivors in Syria and other regions where deportees had been driven, though Ottoman restrictions severely limited their effectiveness. The German government faced particular internal tensions. Reports from German diplomats and military officers had made Berlin fully aware of the atrocities. Some officials, including Ambassador Wolf von Metternich, advocated for strong pressure on the Ottoman government to cease the deportations. However, military leaders argued that maintaining the Ottoman alliance was essential to the war effort, and that alienating Constantinople over internal matters would be strategically disastrous. This tension led to a compromise that satisfied no one. Germany issued private protests to Ottoman leaders while avoiding public condemnation that might damage the alliance. Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg reportedly told Ottoman officials that the deportations were creating serious problems for Germany's international reputation, but stopped short of threatening consequences if they continued. The Ottoman leadership, recognizing German dependency on their participation in the war, largely ignored these weak objections. Individual Germans took more decisive action despite their government's equivocation. Armin Wegener's photographs and reports reached Germany through unofficial channels, stirring public debate. Johannes Lepsius published his documented account of the atrocities, challenging the official German silence. These voices created a domestic German discourse that questioned the morality of alliance with a regime committing such crimes. International law at the time offered few mechanisms for intervention. The concept of state sovereignty remained nearly absolute. What a government did to its own citizens within its own borders was generally considered beyond the legitimate concern of other nations. The Armenian deportations thus occurred in a legal vacuum, where moral outrage had no corresponding framework for effective action. Some neutral nations attempted diplomatic mediation. Switzerland and Sweden, maintaining relations with both the Ottoman Empire and Allied powers, offered to facilitate negotiations or provide humanitarian corridors. These efforts foundered on Ottoman intransigence and the reality that the deportations were not a policy the government was willing to negotiate, but rather a fundamental decision about the empire's demographic future. By 1917, as the United States entered the war against Germany, the possibility of holding Ottoman officials accountable gained credibility. American entry shifted the balance of power decisively toward the Allies, making eventual Ottoman defeat increasingly likely. Allied leaders began speaking more explicitly about post-war justice, promising that those responsible for atrocities would face consequences once the fighting ended. Yet even as these promises were made, the practical challenges of justice remained daunting. Identifying specific perpetrators, gathering admissible evidence, establishing legal frameworks for prosecution. All of these would require resources and political will that might not survive the transition from wartime outrage to post-war exhaustion. The international response to the Armenian atrocities thus embodied a fundamental tension between moral conviction and practical capability, between the desire for justice and the constraints of international relations. The tragedy unfolding in Anatolia was teaching the world a bitter lesson about the limits of international action in the face of determined state violence. Future generations would struggle with the same questions: how to prevent such crimes, how to intervene when prevention fails, and how to ensure accountability when intervention proves impossible. The Armenian genocide became an early test of these questions, and the international community's response revealed how far the world remained from adequate answers. The Armistice of Mudros, signed on October 30, 1918, brought an end to Ottoman participation in the Great War. The empire's defeat opened the possibility, long promised by Allied powers, of holding perpetrators accountable for the atrocities committed against the Armenian population. What followed was an attempt at justice that would prove as revealing in its limitations as in its achievements. British forces occupied Constantinople in November 1918, assuming control of the capital and establishing military administration. Among their priorities was gathering evidence for potential war crimes prosecutions. British investigators began compiling documentation, interviewing survivors, and identifying Ottoman officials believed responsible for planning and implementing the deportations and massacres. The Ottoman government itself, now under new leadership following the flight of the Committee of Union and Progress members who had ruled during the war, took the remarkable step of establishing its own courts-martial to try those accused of crimes against Armenians. These tribunals, convened in Constantinople beginning in early 1919, represented an unprecedented instance of a government prosecuting its own officials for atrocities committed under state authority. The trials produced extensive documentation. Prosecutors presented telegrams ordering deportations, testimony from Turkish officials who had witnessed or participated in killings, and accounts from survivors. The evidence revealed the bureaucratic machinery that had coordinated the destruction across multiple provinces. Specific orders from Interior Minister Talat Pasha and other Committee of Union and Progress leaders were entered into the record, establishing a clear chain of command. Several officials were convicted in absentia, including Talat, Enver Pasha, and other leaders who had fled the empire as defeat became inevitable. Lower-ranking officials actually in custody received sentences ranging from imprisonment to death. The governor of Yozgat, Kemal Bey, was convicted of organizing massacres and sentenced to death, a sentence that was carried out. Other provincial administrators faced similar judgments. Yet the Constantinople trials faced significant obstacles. The new Ottoman government, weak and struggling for legitimacy, lacked the power to fully pursue justice. Many witnesses feared retribution for testifying. Documents had been destroyed or hidden. Most importantly, the primary architects of the atrocities had escaped to Germany and elsewhere, beyond the reach of Ottoman courts. British authorities, recognizing the limitations of the Ottoman tribunals, detained dozens of suspected war criminals for potential trial by an international court. These detainees, held in Malta, included high-ranking military officers and civilian administrators. The British government began developing plans for an international tribunal that would prosecute those most responsible for the Armenian atrocities. However, the political landscape was shifting in ways that would undermine these justice efforts. In Anatolia, a nationalist movement under Mustafa Kemal was gaining strength, rejecting the authority of the defeated Ottoman government and resisting Allied occupation. This movement portrayed the trials as victor's justice imposed by foreign powers, rallying Turkish public opinion against the proceedings. The British government faced pressure to resolve the Malta detentions. Negotiations with Kemal's nationalist government, which was becoming the de facto authority in Anatolia, included discussions of prisoner exchanges. British soldiers captured during the Turkish War of Independence might be traded for the detainees held in Malta. Strategic considerations began outweighing justice concerns. By 1921, the international political will for prosecuting Ottoman war criminals had largely evaporated. The Paris Peace Conference had created the League of Nations, but had failed to establish effective international criminal courts. Britain and France were exhausted from the war and faced their own domestic pressures. The United States, which had never formally declared war on the Ottoman Empire, showed little interest in pursuing prosecutions. In October 1921, Britain released the Malta detainees without trial, exchanging them for British prisoners held by Turkish nationalist forces. The decision represented a pragmatic calculation that maintaining relations with the emerging Turkish state outweighed the pursuit of accountability for wartime atrocities. Most of those released returned to Turkey, where some assumed positions in the new government being established by Kemal. The Constantinople trials, meanwhile, had been suspended as the nationalist movement gained control. Records from the proceedings were scattered or lost. Some documentation survived in British archives, preserving evidence that would prove invaluable to future historians, but the trials themselves ended without completing their work. A few perpetrators did face accountability through other means. Talaat Pasha, living in exile in Berlin, was assassinated in 1921 by Sogomon Tehlirian, an Armenian survivor seeking vengeance. Tehlirian's subsequent trial in Germany became an international sensation, with his defense presenting extensive evidence of Turkish atrocities to justify his actions. A German court acquitted him, a verdict widely interpreted as moral judgment on the crimes that had driven him to violence. The incomplete nature of the post-war accountability efforts established patterns that would recur throughout the 20th century. International promises of justice proved easier to make than to fulfill. Political considerations repeatedly trumped moral imperatives. The difficulties of prosecuting state-sponsored atrocities across borders and sovereignty boundaries remained largely unresolved. Yet the Constantinople trials and the broader accountability effort left an important legacy. They established documentary evidence, created legal precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity, and demonstrated that at least some believed perpetrators of such crimes should face consequences. The records produced during these proceedings would become crucial sources for historians seeking to understand what had happened and how it had been organized. The failure to achieve full justice was profound, but the attempt itself represented a step toward a world where such crimes might not be committed with complete impunity. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923, formally dissolved the Ottoman Empire and established the Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal's leadership. The 600-year-old empire that had once controlled 3 continents ceased to exist, replaced by a nation-state built on dramatically different foundations. But the empire's end stemmed from causes far more complex than simple military defeat. Causes rooted in the catastrophic decisions made during the war years. The Ottoman Empire had survived military defeats before, It had lost territory in the Balkans, ceded land to Russia, and weathered internal rebellions throughout the 19th century, yet had persisted. What made the aftermath of the Great War different was not the scale of territorial loss, but rather the fundamental destruction of the multi-ethnic fabric that had sustained Ottoman governance for centuries. The empire's strength had always resided in its ability to manage diversity. Muslims, Christians, and Jews had coexisted under Ottoman rule through systems that granted communal autonomy while maintaining central authority. Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Arabs, Kurds, and Turks had all found places within this complex mosaic. The empire's identity was inherently multi-ethnic, drawing administrative talent, commercial energy, and cultural richness from its varied populations. The systematic destruction of the Armenian population shattered this foundational principle. Archives preserved in multiple countries document not merely the immediate death toll, which scholars estimate exceeded 1 million lives, but also the erasure of an entire civilization from landscapes it had inhabited since antiquity. Churches that had stood for 1,000 years were demolished. Towns where Armenian craftsmen had created goods traded across continents were emptied. Schools that had educated generations of Armenian intellectuals were closed forever. The economic consequences reverberated throughout what remained of the empire. Armenian merchants had controlled significant portions of trade networks connecting Anatolia to European and Asian markets. Armenian bankers had provided capital for commercial ventures. Armenian craftsmen, in fields from jewelry to textiles to construction, had driven important sectors of the economy. Their removal created voids that could not be quickly filled, contributing to economic collapse that weakened the empire's ability to recover from wartime devastation. The social fabric suffered damage that transcended economic calculation. Communities where Turkish, Armenian, and Greek neighbors had lived for generations were transformed into ethnically homogeneous settlements through violence and expulsion. The cosmopolitan character of cities like Smyrna and Constantinople, where multiple languages and cultures had mingled freely, began eroding. The empire that had defined itself through diversity was destroying that very diversity. International perception of the Ottoman Empire underwent irreversible change. The atrocities against Armenians, documented by witnesses from multiple nations and publicized worldwide, transformed the empire from a legitimate, if declining power, into a regime associated with crimes against humanity. This reputational damage affected diplomatic relations, economic partnerships, and the willingness of foreign powers to support Ottoman territorial integrity in post-war negotiations. The rise of Turkish nationalism, which would ultimately replace the multi-ethnic Ottoman system with an ethnically defined nation-state, was both cause and consequence of the Armenian destruction. The Committee of Union and Progress, leaders who ordered the deportations, had embraced an ideology that saw ethnic and religious diversity as weakness rather than strength. Their actions during the war created conditions that made the old Ottoman model unsustainable and paved the way for Kemal's nationalist vision. Kemal himself understood that the empire could not be salvaged. His project focused instead on creating something entirely new, a Turkish republic that would abandon Ottoman multiculturalism in favor of Turkish nationalism. The population exchanges with Greece in 1923, which forcibly relocated over 1 million Greek Orthodox Christians from Anatolia and hundreds of thousands of Muslims from Greece, completed the demographic transformation that had begun with the Armenian deportations. The empire's moral authority, whatever remained of it, had been irrevocably compromised. How could a government that had systematically destroyed its own subjects maintain legitimacy? The Constantinople trials had demonstrated that even some Turks recognized the actions as criminal. But the nationalist movement rejected this accountability, building instead a narrative of wartime necessity that denied or minimized the atrocities. This denial created an ethical foundation too unstable to support an imperial structure that required trust across ethnic and religious lines. By 1922, when the Sultanate was officially abolished, the Ottoman Empire existed only as a legal fiction. The institutions that had governed for 6 centuries had collapsed under the weight of military defeat, economic ruin, and moral bankruptcy. The destruction of the Armenian population had not merely been one atrocity among many in a brutal war. It had been a self-inflicted wound that severed the empire from its own historical identity and made its continuation impossible. The Turkish Republic that emerged from Ottoman ruins was explicitly designed to avoid the multi-ethnic complexity that had characterized the empire, emphasized Turkish identity, Turkish language, and a secular Turkish nationalism that left no space for the kind of diversity that had once been Ottoman strength. This transformation represented not evolution, but rather repudiation of the Ottoman model, an acknowledgement that the old system had been destroyed beyond repair. History would remember the Armenian genocide as one of the 20th century's great crimes, a precursor to horrors that would follow. But it was also the wound that ended an empire, the decision from which there could be no recovery. The Ottoman Empire did not fall primarily to Allied armies, or Arab revolts, or nationalist movements, though all of these contributed. It fell because it had betrayed its own foundational principles, destroyed communities. It was meant to protect, and revealed that its system of governance could produce not just injustice, but systematic annihilation. An empire that commits genocide against its own people has already ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The formal dissolution that followed was merely acknowledgement of a death that had occurred years earlier, in the deserts where a civilization was destroyed and an empire lost whatever had made it worth preserving. If this story has moved you, if you believe these histories must be remembered and shared, then show your support by clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. These are not easy stories to tell or to hear, but they are essential ones. Understanding how empires fall, how seemingly stable systems can produce unthinkable atrocities, and how the choices of leaders echo through generations helps us recognize warning signs in our own time. Your engagement helps ensure these crucial historical lessons reach others who need to hear them. Share this video, continue the conversation, and join us as we explore more of history's most significant and often overlooked stories.